For much of my life, I've not been a Christian. My father was Jewish by race, agnostic really by conviction. My mother was not a churchgoer. So growing up, I was not a churchgoer, and I became really an atheist. And I found the whole subject really of Christianity and religion very boring. I wasn't interested in it, and I just thought it was completely irrelevant to my life. My first year at university, I was sharing rooms with a guy called Nicky Lee. And I'd said to Nicky, because I'd kind of come across Christians in my year off, and I was deeply suspicious. I never understood why they smiled so much. And I said to Nicky, whatever you do, don't let them in your room. But I was too late, because he came back, he and his then girlfriend, now his wife, Scylla, and they told me that they had become Christians. And I was horrified. I mean, they were such lovely people. And I thought, what's happened? They've joined some cult. I better help them. But I thought, I don't really know how to help them because I know nothing about it. So I better read up on the subject. I better read up on philosophy and religion. The only thing that I could find, because it was quite late at night, the only thing that I could find in my room was an old Bible I'd had for RE at school. So that night I started reading it. And I read all the way through Matthew's Gospel, all the way through Mark, all the way through Luke. I got about halfway through John's Gospel when I fell asleep. And the following morning I carried on reading. I read all that day, all the next day, all the next day. I was a student, I didn't have any work to do. And when I got to the end of the New Testament, I came to the conclusion, it's true. And what I want to look at tonight is why. What is the evidence? I don't believe that you can prove Christianity kind of like a mathematical proof, or a scientific proof, or even a philosophical proof. But it's based on evidence, more like historical evidence, more like the kind of evidence in a legal case you might put before a jury. I spent 10 years studying law and practicing as a barrister, so for me personally, evidence is very important. I don't think I could just take a kind of blind leap of faith. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Sometimes people say, but hang on a second, I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? That's what I believed. I thought, because I was an atheist, there was no point in even looking at who Jesus was. But for a reason I'll come to later on, I found that it's actually through the life, death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus, that I came to believe that there is a God. So what is the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? The answer is that there's a great deal of evidence. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The first century Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, says this. He's talking about Pontius Pilate, and he says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But more important, there's evidence inside the New Testament. Some say, well, the New Testament was written a very long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially, the more manuscripts we have, and the earlier they are, the less doubt there is about the original. So, let's compare other ancient texts. You'll see there in the manual various other historical texts. So, for example, you'll see Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy that we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap, we have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, 900-year gap, 20 copies. When it comes to the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130, and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 others. So, one of the greatest textual critics ever, F.J.A. Hort, said this: "In the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings." And no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. Sir Frederick Kenyon, who's an expert in this field, sums it up like this: "The interval then between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established." So, we know from evidence outside and inside the New Testament that he existed, but who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness, had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, bereavement, suffering, being tortured, and the experience of death. Many today would say, okay, he was a human being, but only a human being, albeit maybe he was a great religious teacher. So, for example, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code suggests Jesus was not the Son of God. He was a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man of staggering influence, a great religious teacher, but not the Son of God. On the other hand, Bono, lead singer of U2, says this: "I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I do believe it, odd as it sounds." So that's the issue. What evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Would you like to turn to Matthew chapter 16, verse 13? When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Son of Man was Jesus' favorite way of referring to himself. "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets." In other words, people are saying, "You're a great religious teacher." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's possible to be with someone for a long time and not realize who they are. I love playing squash, and I play squash pretty regularly, but at the squash club that I belong to, there's also a gym, and sometimes if there's no one to play squash with, I go into the gym. One time, some time ago, I went into the gym and I was doing some weights there, and there was a great big guy who actually I didn't realize who he was. His name is Paul Ackford. He was an England rugby international, ex-policeman, weighs about 230 pounds, and I was doing weights with him. He was lifting huge weights. I was lifting puny little weights. But afterwards, we were chatting in the changing rooms upstairs, and I was trying to make polite conversation. So I said, do you do any other sport? I meant apart from weightlifting. I think he assumed that I must know that he played rugby, so he said, yeah, he said, I play a bit of squash. So I said, oh, is squash your main sport? He said, no, he said, I play rugby. So I said, oh, really, do you play for a club? He said, yeah, he said, Harlequins. So I said, oh, Harlequins, I've heard of them, they're rather good, aren't they? He said, yeah. I said, don't they have some England players playing for them? He said, yeah, 5. So I said, have you ever played for England? He said, yeah. I said, when did you last play for England? He said, 2 weeks ago in the World Cup. And I looked at him, I said, you're Paul Ackford. I'd been with him all that time, and I hadn't realized who he was. And the disciples looked at Jesus and they said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now the question is, were they right? What is the evidence? There are 2 parts to this argument, really, because the first part is who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was anything more than a human being, a great religious teacher, that's the end of the argument. And some people say Jesus never claimed to be God. And it's true, he didn't go around with a t-shirt saying, I am God. But when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part of the argument. Secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So let's look at the first part of the argument. What did he say about himself? And there are 3 pieces of evidence. First of all, his teaching centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. Jesus, who was the most humble and self-effacing person who ever lived, in pointing people to God, pointed to himself. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. We all have a kind of, what you might describe as spiritual hunger. 3 20th century psychologists all recognize this. Freud said, people are hungry for love. Jung, people are hungry for security. Adler, people are hungry for significance. Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. In other words, if you want that spiritual hunger satisfied, come to me. Addiction is a major problem in our society. Jesus said, if the Son sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you will be free indeed. Many people are depressed, disillusioned, in despair. They're in a dark place. Jesus said, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. For me, it was as if I was kind of staggering around in a dark room. And the moment I experienced a relationship with God through Jesus, it was as if a light had been switched on and I could see. I remember also before I was a Christian, death was something that I kind of avoided thinking about. I sort of always pushed it to the back of my mind because I suppose I was afraid. And we live in a society now where it's not really even politically correct to use the word death. But the fact is, we die. And Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. those who believe in me will live, even though they die. Mother Teresa was asked shortly before her death, are you at all afraid of dying? And she said, how can I be? Dying is going home to God. I've never been afraid. No, on the contrary, she said, I'm really looking forward to it. I think most people recognize, don't they, that materialism can in itself never satisfy. And people are looking for some kind of spiritual reality. Jesus said, I'm the way. People are looking for values on which to base their lives. Jesus said, I'm the truth. I think all of us want some ultimate meaning, purpose to our lives. Jesus said, I'm the life. Other people said, that's the way, that's truth, that's life. Jesus said, I'm the way and the truth and the life. He said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. He said, if you have seen me, you have seen God. I heard about a 5-year-old child who was drawing a picture. And mother said, what are you doing? The child said, I'm drawing a picture of God. So the mother said, don't be silly, you can't draw a picture of God. Nobody knows what God looks like. The child said, well, they will do when I finish my picture. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. Second piece of evidence is a kind of indirect piece of evidence. Jesus said a number of things which, although they weren't direct claims to be God, show that he regarded himself as being in the same position as God. Take one example. Jesus said to people, your sins are forgiven. To forgive those who've sinned against us is something that we can all do. But to forgive those who've sinned against others is something only God can do. Third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. Would you like to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 20, verse 26? John chapter 20, verse 26. This is after the resurrection. Jesus appeared to a group of the disciples, but Thomas was not there. And when these disciples, who were friends of Thomas, said to him, Thomas, we've seen Jesus risen from the dead. Thomas said, I'm not going to believe that. I'll only believe if I can actually see the nail marks in his hands and actually put my finger in his side. And then we pick up the story at the end of verse 26. Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Thomas said to him, my Lord and my God. Thomas called him God. And Jesus didn't say, hey, hang on a second. That's going too far. What he said to him, well, you were a bit slow to get the point. He says, then Jesus said to him, because you've seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. If you only had time, if somebody says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you only had time to show them one verse, I don't recommend doing it on one verse, but if you only had time, I would suggest showing them John chapter 10, verse 30 to 33. The background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this, verse 30, I and the Father are one. Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. So that's the first part of the argument. What did Jesus say about himself? Obviously, claims like these need to be tested, because all kind of people claim to be all kinds of things. There are people who say they're Elvis Presley, resurrected from the dead. How do we test such people's claims? Well, Jesus claimed to be the unique Son of God, God made flesh. It seems to me, there are a whole variety of possibilities, but they basically boil down to three. The first is that it wasn't true, and that he knew it was untrue, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and an evil one at that. Second possibility is it was not true, but he really didn't realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, in which case he was deluded. I think we'd say he was insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it's true. C.S. Lewis put it like this: a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So what evidence is there to support what he said? Well, I guess one area you might look at, first area you might look at, what did he teach? The teaching of Jesus is widely acknowledged to be the greatest teaching that's ever fallen from the lips of a human being. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have them do to you. Love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. John Mortimer, who's the creator of Rumpole and is a leading atheist, and has often attacked Christians and still describes himself as an atheist. But he says now he's had a change of heart. And he describes himself as a leading member of the Atheists for Christ Society. Asked what brought about this change, he said, seeing the impact on society of a generation that has rejected God and, as a result, Christian ethics. What is beyond doubt, he writes, is that the Gospels provide a system of ethics to which we must return if we are to avoid social disasters. And the article was headed, Even the Unbelievers Should Go Back to Church Today. Jesus' teaching has been the foundation of really our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. We're making progress in every field of science and technology. But no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. Then, what about his lifestyle? What about the things that he did? Jesus must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. People sometimes say, oh, Christianity is boring. Certainly wouldn't have been boring being with Jesus. Can you imagine how amazing it would be to go to a party with Jesus? Do you remember one time he went to a party and the wine ran out? And he said, see those stone jugs over there, stone jars? Fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of water each and start pouring them out for the guests. And as they did so and poured it out, out came Chateau Lafite, 45, BC, that is. Imagine how wonderful it would be to go, say, hospital visiting with Jesus. And one time he went into a hospital and there was a man in there who'd been an invalid for 38 years. And he said, get up, take up your bed and walk. And the man walked out of the hospital, healed. Imagine going on a picnic with Jesus. Don't bring any food. Come as you are. Or even imagine going to a funeral with Jesus. I remember one time he went to a funeral. And when he arrived, the guy had been dead for 4 days. And he said, take the stone away. And I said, oh, we can't do that. It'd be a terrible smell. I said, just take it away. And the man came out, wrapped in his grave clothes. He said, untie him and let him go. Not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless, his love for people who society had written off, the outcasts. And the way he set people free, and still sets people free today. And of course, I suppose, ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character has impressed millions who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus, the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. There's an article in the Spectator 2 weeks ago by Matthew Paris, who describes himself as an avowed atheist. And his point was, he said, I've got such huge respect for Jesus because his life was so radical. It was so inconvenient. He said this: if Jesus had not existed, the church most certainly would not have invented him. Look at Jesus' courage. Look, when he was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. One of the things said about him in the Gospels is he has done all things beautifully. Dostoevsky described him as infinitely beautiful. Could such a person really be evil or unbalanced? Fourth piece of evidence is his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies, spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. It could be suggested he was a kind of clever con man who deliberately set out, he read all these prophecies and he thought, right, I'm going to go through and I'm going to fulfill them in my life. The difficulty with that is, first of all, the sheer number of them, and then the fact that, humanly speaking, he had no control over many of these things. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. You know, if it's a con man looking through, oh, goodness, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. Fifth piece of evidence, and by far the most important, his conquest of death. The physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And this brings me back to the point where I started. Why don't we begin with, is there a God? The New Testament theologian and now Bishop of Durham, Tom Wright, said this, and this is so important. It's quite a difficult sentence to follow, but it's crucial to the argument tonight. He said this: the Christian claim is not that Jesus is to be understood in terms of a God about whom we already know. It is this: the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that the world has a creator, and that creator is to be seen in terms of, through the lens of, Jesus. So what evidence is there that the resurrection really happened? Let me summarize under four main headings. First of all, his absence from the tomb. The lockers of the tomb is well known. Many theories have been put forward to explain the fact that Jesus' body was absent from the tomb the first Easter day, but none of them are very convincing. First, it's been suggested that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and he recovered in some way in the cool of the tomb. But If any of you have seen Mel Gibson's film The Passion, you know that what it means to undergo a Roman flogging and crucifixion. People didn't survive that. A stone weighing 1.5 tons was put in front of the tomb. Furthermore, there's a fascinating piece of evidence. Would you like to turn to John chapter 19, verse 33? But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. That breaking legs was to speed up death by crucifixion. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. It appears that there had been a separation of the clot and the serum, which we now know is good medical evidence that he was dead. But they didn't have that medical evidence at the time. They were simply writing it because that's what happened. Then people have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body, and then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But leaving aside the fact that the tomb was guarded, it's psychologically improbable that here is a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. I have a friend called Ian Walker, who's a scientist at Cambridge. He became a Christian because he said he could not believe that the disciples would have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known, if they'd taken the body, was not true. Others said, well, maybe the authorities took the body. That's the least probable of all, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people were saying Jesus is risen from the dead was to say, no, he's not. Here's the body. Look how quickly we were shown the bodies of Saddam Hussein's sons when they were killed, because they wanted us to know they were dead. Other people say, well, maybe robbers stole the body. That's the least likely of all, because I haven't actually talked about the empty tomb, because the tomb was not empty. Jesus' body was absent. When the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing that for robbers to take. They had collapsed, like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterflies emerged. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. Second piece of evidence. First, the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb. Secondly, his presence with the disciples. He was seen. Sometimes people say, well, hallucination. Yeah, people do hallucinate, but it is highly unlikely that even two people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at one time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then look at the nature of the appearances. Hallucinations are subjective. They have no objective reality. It's kind of like seeing a ghost. But look at these appearances. Luke chapter 24, verse 36. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your mind? Look at my hands and my feet. It is I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have." When he'd said this, he showed them his hands and feet. And while they still did not believe it because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and he ate it in their presence. I have a friend called James Odgers who became a Christian because of this. He said he could not believe that a ghost would eat broiled fish. And then, third piece of evidence is the immediate impact. Here were a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding. And something occurred that totally changed them, so that they went around telling everybody, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there's this explosion in 300 years right across the whole known world. It's a story of a peaceful revolution with no parallel, really, in the history of the world. Fourth piece of evidence is Christian experience down the ages. Countless millions of people down the ages have experienced the risen Jesus Christ. And it's people of every ethnicity, continent, nationality, every economic, social, intellectual background from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. Millions of Christians all around the world today experiencing this relationship. I told you at the beginning that I, through reading the New Testament, I came to the conclusion it's true. But I didn't want to become a Christian. I thought if I become a Christian, my life will be miserable from now on. And I tried to put it off. I tried to find ways not to become a Christian, but eventually I just said yes. And at that moment, I experienced, I think, what unconsciously I'd been searching for all my life. I experienced something that gave ultimate meaning and purpose to life in a relationship with Jesus. And that was the last place in the world I expected to find it. It was at that moment it kind of dropped from my head to my heart. And look, I'm far from perfect. I mess up. I've got masses of failings. But I can tell you that over the last 32 years since then, I have experienced the love of Jesus Christ, his power, and a relationship with him that convinces me that he really is alive. Sherlock Holmes said this. He said, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And I suppose what I've been trying to argue tonight is that when you look at the claims of Jesus, who he said he was, and the possibilities of him being evil or deluded, I think we can rule them out as being impossible. When you look at his teaching, his life, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, those explanations become, to say that he was evil or deluded is kind of absurd, it's illogical. And therefore, the point that Sherlock Holmes made, when you eliminate those, whatever remains must be the truth. And actually, when you look at those, they lend the strongest possible support to Jesus' own consciousness of being a man whose identity was God. C.S. Lewis put it like this. He said, we're faced then with a frightening alternative. The man we're talking about was and is just what he said, or else insane or something worse. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither insane nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God.